Yeah, all right, so let's get rolling. All right, so last week we talked about, we were kind of continuing through Romans, and we got to chapter 9 and kind of started just the introduction of chapter 9. Chapter 9 we're going to talk about in two parts, starting today, the rest of it. The idea that last week we talked about how maybe it's that we like Christ a whole lot, we love what he's done for us, but in the end we don't really have any interest in doing what he did. We don't have any interest, because Paul's introduction in chapter 9 really is his Christ-likeness moment, right? He has become like Christ, his willingness to perish for his people. But how we a lot of times aren't willing to perish, and sometimes it's easier to pretend you don't know and didn't hear. I think that's really one of the biggest things for a lot of us sitting in church is it's just easier for us to step back and say it's easier for us to really just pretend we didn't hear and we didn't know. That's become kind of a good defense. I didn't know, I didn't hear. We just sort of move on, and I think it creates a problem. So as we continue through Romans this morning, we're going to talk about children of promise. So I'm going to start naturally by talking about something I have learned a lot about recently, because I teach this class called Human Geography, which it sounds probably boring maybe to you, but I think it's probably the most interesting subject I've ever just sort of casually delved into, and it's a phenomenal subject. But one of the issues that it has is this thing called environmental determinism. And the idea is, and this, don't worry, this ties in, I'm not just randomly talking. The idea is that the environment that you live in as people, the environment that you live in has a determining quality in what you ultimately end up being. It was sort of the original hypothesis for why everyone's the way they are. Why you go to certain regions and see certain cultural traits, why you go to certain regions and see certain attitudes, why you go to certain regions and see progress versus lack of progress. Why life in the tropics is considered chill, right? But life in the desert, no one would ever say they relax a lot, right? It's why you don't think of the Inuit people as people who just kick their feet up and have a nice day, right? They're always out ice fishing. So we have this idea that the environment has somehow told us what we have to be, that our physical environment around us. The problem with it is that ultimately it led to racism. That ultimately it led to this idea that we could look down on people or explain why certain people were more advanced based solely on environment. This is one of the original issues that really allowed Europe to feel elite. Is Europe felt there was something about Europe that just made it better than everywhere else. And it wasn't the people necessarily that started the issue. It was this idea that Africa hasn't developed because it's a primitive land, it's a primitive people, and somehow that they're impacted. And so that kind of led to this interesting discussion of what's called possibilism. That really anything's possible, right? It's a really big word for, right? I mean, we don't know, right? But the idea is that, yeah, your environment impacts you, okay? If you live in Saharan Africa, there's a really good chance you're probably not, walking around in sandals, shorts, and a tank top. Because it's so hot and the sun is so brutal, you have to cover. It's the only way to survive. If you live in the tropics, you live a very different life. In the tropics, you don't wake up every day and go, where are we going to find some water? Because it's everywhere. You wake up in the desert every day and you go, probably should go find some water, okay? So it does impact the way you live, it does impact who you are, but it doesn't tell you who you are. It impacts you, but it doesn't tell you. And so, a good quote on that is that life is like a game of cards, right? The hand that is dealt you is determinism, but the way you play it's free will. The idea is you're dealt a set of cards. That kind of is where you start. You might start impoverished, you might start wealthy, you might start whatever. You might be, as somebody who coaches a lot of sports, some kids just got dealt the Grand Slam of DNA, right? Kid walks out there, he's 7 years old, he's 6'1", 245. And there was a kid on this team yesterday, he was like 5'5", and he could be 8 years old, 5'5", It wasn't Travis. Emily is quite 5'5". You know when your son lines up and goes, what should I do with that guy? Block him. But the idea that some kids just get dealt the grand slam of DNA, right? The royal flush, you know? And then some kids get dealt the grand slam of economic birth. Some kids get dealt, I mean, that's just the way it is. That's determinism. But what you do with it ultimately is what you decide, is ultimately what you choose to do. And I know that seems kind of like a secular way of approaching it, but the reality is ultimately what you do with what you've been dealt with is your choice. It's a decision that you make. And ultimately you, because of your free will, determine. Even though determinism is what you're born into. And sometimes it's hard. We live in a country now where everybody wants to run around and say, determinism has decided for me that I am disadvantaged, or I can't do it. I can never rise above. I can never change. You know, we have people who have become so inclined to believe that they have no role. And last night after our long day of football, and you know, if I believed in karma, last night would have been a karma day. Because all day long, I was complaining about this program we were playing. Because their people were obnoxious, and their coaches were screaming at the referees and screaming at us. And their coach got thrown out of the last game with 2 seconds left. All right, how mad did the referees have to be to stop a game with 2 seconds left and be willing to do the paperwork? Right? This is not just you're gone. This means they have to write a whole report. How mad do you have to make them at 9:30 at night to go, you know what, it's worth it. And I'm sitting there going, this program, I'm done, this is horrible. So a fight breaks out in the parking lot. Oh, that was good. And I'm like, so, yeah. Yeah, but the fight
was it Lisa?
The fight was the parents. No, she was home in bed. No, the fight was with the parents. So I go running out and I'm like, I knew it, these people, I'm done with it. And it was our people. 2 women.
Wow.
One pulled a knife.
What?
That's legit.
They're married to brothers.
Oh no.
Oh, so there's.
Apparently, they fight. It's what they do. And the husbands egg it up. And I go walking out, and I'm hearing stuff being screamed, and I was like, what in the world? And the Rams guys are all like, it's not us, man. It's not our people. And I'm like, who are they? And they're like, they're your people. And I'm like, huh. So I start throwing people out. Well, so I get this lady. She's holding a 2-year-old, maybe a 3-year-old child, and she's screaming at the top of her lung F-bombs at this other lady. And I'm like, what are you doing? And I go, who are you? I didn't know who she was. And she's like, well, I'm so-and-so's friend. And I'm like, we don't use that kind of language on this campus, ever. I said, this is a Christian school. They said, we don't talk like that. I said, it's not appropriate. And she's like, you don't understand how mad she made me. And I'm looking at her and I'm going, I don't care. And in my head, I'm like screaming, you're holding a baby, right? But I'm like, don't say it. And she's like, I'm allowed to do this because she made me mad. And I'm like, you're an adult. Part of being an adult is adulting. Right? And so I'm looking around, and so I asked the one family, I said, you know what, you guys are no longer welcome in our program. And I said, get off the campus, don't come back. And the next lady's like, she's like, you know that we had nothing to do with it, she started it. And I was like, well, I'm gonna get to the bottom of it. 20 minutes later, she comes back to tell me because apparently one of the brothers drove off with the keys. Because apparently when you go to fight, you throw your keys on the ground. It's been a while since I've been in a fight between sister-in-laws. But, so the brother drove off with the keys of the sister-in-law. And so the mom, she's probably in her late 50s. She comes up to me to tell me that her other son's daughter is innocent. And I was like, okay. And she smells like, pot. And I look at her and I go, why are you smoking pot on my campus? She goes, I'm not. I'm like, look, man, that's a pretty distinct scent. And she's like, I'm not. No one is. I'm like, I can smell it everywhere, and you're the only cars. Everyone else is gone. I'm a little scared because I don't know if those dudes are coming back. I got my 13-year-old son here, 14-year-old son here, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. And she's like, well, you know, it was really hard, and everybody's kind of stressed out. And I'm like, well, great, then it's okay. My bad. I'm sorry. I did not realize you were stressed out. But she's like, I have every right to do this because the situation has determined my response. And I'm like, it doesn't determine your response. Nothing does. But it's amazing how many people hide behind, I have to act like this because the situation dictates it. And I'm like, you don't. And I hear it all the time. And I sit there and I say, look, human beings, I get it. We have things, we have factors that go into our lives. And none of us are perfect. But the reality is, in the end, the cards that are dealt in front of us, they don't determine what we are. And they don't determine how we respond. We make that decision. We make it every time. You know, football's a non-issue. I mean, it's a nothing in the real world, and I get that. And every week I get the chance to practice this. Because in my head I'm screaming what I want to say. And it's loud. It's so loud sometimes that I don't hear what I say. Right? I'm trying to say the right thing, and okay, everybody let's calm down. But in my head I'm like, you guys are crazy. Are you serious? You know, but it's like you work on this and you're trying to. And sometimes I sit there and I think, I'm well within my rights to just finally blow it and start throwing nachos at people. I mean, just walk up and leave. Because I'm well within my rights to act like that because the situation has allowed me. And I could walk back to my car with my head held high and say, you know what? I did that because you made me. I have every right to. And I run into it all the time. And it's like I step back and I think, no. The cards do not ultimately make the choice. They may set the stage. They may show me what the hand's going to develop like. But I make a choice. I joke around all the time about playing Texas Hold'em with Drew. Because he's the hardest person to play Texas Hold'em with. Because Drew is crazy. He does not allow the cards to dictate the way he plays. He plays like a wild man. Like sometimes you won't even look at them. And they just throw money in there. And you're like, are you serious? I'm good. But it's like he plays the cards the way he wants to play the cards. He doesn't let the cards tell him what to do. And I think it's so many times in our lives we allow this sort of determined set of principles to decide who we are and what we do. And I get it while you're young, and I get it while you're developing, but the problem is that we don't turn it around. We don't step back. We don't start to reassess. We don't start to reevaluate. We don't make changes. And so we end up sort of rutted in what is sort of determined in day one. And Paul starts to talk about determinism. Okay, now this is obviously not environmental. This would be a spiritual way of looking at it. And he says it's not as though God's word had failed. Because remember last week we talked about how Paul says that my people were given everything. And I wish that I could die so that they'd be saved. I would perish. I would give up my divine eternality. I would give up my opportunity to go to heaven if it would save my people. And then he says, I don't get it. They had the patriarchs. They had all these things. And then he says it's not as if God's word had failed. And I think it's one of those important reminders of what the rest of this is about. Is he says it's not as if God's word had failed. And then he goes into the rest of it. And the rest of it is, for not all who are descended from Israel are Israel, nor because they are his descendants are they all Abraham's children. On the contrary, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. So he says, listen, it's not like everybody who carries the DNA are the people that were the descendants. And you know, just a quick reminder of all of the tree of Abraham. But only one branch was promised. Only one group was given that. And the promise was to Sarah, right? As much as it was to Abraham. He says, I will through her do this, as much as I will through you do this. And so he's focusing on the birth of their child. Now, we had Ishmael, which we could talk about Ishmael forever, to be honest with you, and who Ishmael ultimately, the ultimate length of the branches of that tree. But says, look, through you two, I'm going to bring you this child. I'm going to bring you Isaac. And I'm going to promise to Isaac through you all of these things. And we're going to get to what the point of this is. In other words, it is not the children of physical descent. Okay? It's not the children of physical descent who are God's children. But it is the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. For this was how the promise was stated. At the appointed time I will return, and Sarah will have a son. Now, this is the Abrahamic covenant from, well, it's in 3 parts, but the end of it is in Genesis 12. And he says, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, the focus of this is, he says, look, I'm going to give you to this kid. And through this kid, the world's going to be blessed. Through the presence of this kid, the world is going to be changed. And he does it in 2 parts. He says there will be blessing and there will be curses against you. I mean, he acknowledges that by saying, and whoever curses you. So he said, look, there's going to be people who don't like you. Even though the role that you were going to fill is to be a blessing, is to come along and be a difference maker in the lives of everyone. And it has nothing to do with any sort of, specific lineage here, other than he promised through Isaac. It has nothing to do with Isaac. He promised. Isaac's done nothing yet, right? Isaac hasn't even been born at this promise. Yet God's making this promise. God's putting this forth. And then he says, not only that, but Rebekah's children. Okay, now he's moved down the road. And he says, but Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time by our father, Isaac. Yet before the twins were born, or had done anything good or bad, so it's obvious before they were born, because it doesn't take long for children to be bad after that, in order that God's purpose in election might stand. Okay, so, yet before the twins were born, God had made a determination. Not of who they were going to be, but to who he was going to promise. And then he says, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I love, but Esau I hated. We're getting into what a lot of people struggle with this chapter, which is it really sounds like God determines and removes free will. That God makes one here to do whatever he wants and destroys the other at will. And it sort of creates this, I hope so. I hope when you read you have these questions. It's important to have questions when you read. It's important to step back. But it's also important to understand that nowhere is it determined how they would live. He does not say that Esau will be an awful person and fail me. It says the older will serve the younger. It does not say that Jacob is going to be awesome. It says basically that we're looking at this idea of national and spiritual narrative. These people that we read about, that Paul's pointing out, play a national role. They play part in what's considered a national and spiritual narrative. That God has a direction for this covenant with Abraham. That God is choosing Isaac to do it. One of the great experiments that I've had with young people in Bible class was I had them read the book of Jonah. First day of class, I had them read the first 2 chapters. Second day of class, I had them read chapters 3 and 4. And I said, all you have to do is answer one question from each of the 2 chapters. And they said, okay, what's the question? And I said, why did God relent on his punishment of Jonah? And why did God relent on his punishment of Nineveh? And so I had the high school kids, I said, you can work in groups. So, of course, 100% of their responses are because they repented. Right? And I said, that's interesting. I said, read Jonah's prayer again and tell me where he repents. Read it again and tell me where he says, you're right, God. Those people deserve compassion, my bad. I will now go love those 2 million people. I feel awful for wanting you to kill 2 million people. Tell me where it says that. So the kids read it again. And they all get kind of quiet, which is awesome for high schoolers. And really makes for better days when you figure out how to shut them up. And I mean teach them. Did I say shut them up? I meant teach. And so I sat there and I said, now tell me where it says that Nineveh served Yahweh. Where does it say Nineveh does? They went, don't kill us, please don't kill us. I will shave my head, I will kill the goat, I will bring forth the cattle, I will do whatever. Please don't destroy us. And I said, tell me why. So tell me why he relented. And they would sit there and they, you know how kids get, they start pouring out all these really phenomenal ideas. And I said, are you ready for the answer? And they're like, yes, please tell us the answer. And I said, you're going to hate it. And they said, okay, what's the answer? I said, because he chose to. And they're like, well, yeah, but why? Because he chose to. And his choice is not up to your judgment. You don't get to step back and go, yeah, but God, I don't get it. And I said, the Bible said, because he chose to. He made a decision. And Jonah knew it. That's why Jonah was mad. Because Jonah's the world's biggest doofus, right? I mean, he gets spit up on the shore, and God's like, okay, I won't have you slowly digested over the next 6 months in the belly of that whale. Because I'm relenting. And then he goes and he gets mad when God relents against Nineveh, right? But it's, God makes decisions all the time. We somehow step back in our intense elitism and mental superiority and go, yeah, I just don't get it. And what's amazing is you rarely see him explain himself. Because he didn't, nowhere does, you know, he doesn't step back. He doesn't have to. We act like he does. I remember listening, I think was it, okay, Sam Harris maybe, and he was saying that, you know, when I get to heaven, God's going to have to apologize to me. And I'm like, yeah, let me know how that goes. Right? Because the best part is, like if I was God, I wouldn't even explain why I was now punishing you. Right? You walk in with that attitude, I'm not even going to explain it to you. You're just going to deal with it, what you get. And God makes decisions and chooses. And like I said, going back to that verse, right? Before they had done anything good or bad, it had nothing to do with their character. And we sit there and we say all the time, no, it has to. It doesn't. Have you ever read the story of Jacob and Esau? I'm with Esau all the way. Because he's not a devious little squirt. Right? He's not lying to people and deceiving his dad. He's just awesome. Right? Like when I think Esau, I think like Russell Crowe from Gladiator. Right? I'm just being honest. You know, when I think Jacob, I think like Sheldon from Big Bang Theory. You know, I'm on his side. I just do, right? Because every time it comes time for him to fight, other than that one time, he kind of runs. It's kind of soft. Right? And then he says, what then shall we say? Is God unjust? Not at all. Because that's what we need to say. God's not fair. Right? Because he's not fair. Why did Esau get such a bad deal? Why did Ishmael get a bad deal? It's not Ishmael's fault. Ishmael was not born out of that relationship, and it was his fault. He didn't go, well, if I could choose anything, I choose to be the enemy of Israel. He was an innocent before he had done anything good or bad. And we sit there and we say, it's unfair. And I tell kids all the time, right? We don't have a justice system. I tell you guys this all the time. We don't have a justice system in America. We have a fairness system. We care why you do things. Right? Why did you commit murder? That's a question. Because the reality is we have 19 different forms of murder. Right? Manslaughter, man 2, man 3, man 9. Involuntary, voluntary, vehicular. Murder 1, murder 2, crime of passion, whatever. We've got 1,000 of them. Because we actually care why you did it. We don't have a justice system. God is just. But we try to apply that fairness quotient to him all the time. Well, it's not fair. And so Paul's saying, listen to Israel, because he's talking specifically to his people. He says, for he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. It does not, therefore, depend on human desire or effort, but on God's mercy. I gotta believe that for a lot of you, this has got to be a hard thing to deal with, and that's why we're dealing with it in 2 parts. Because next week he actually throws Pharaoh into this mix, which makes it even better, right? Because now we're talking. Because really, this becomes a free will wrestling point. But in this part, God's made a determination, but it's to a historical vocation. He said, "You're going to go be this." He does it to Samuel, right? Samuel did not have say-so. He was lifted for a historical vocation, for a narrative, for a role. And it does not determine then how everyone else lives. They still make their own choices. Now, like I said, in many of these historical vocations, they don't even make good choices. We see Moses lose his mind and get frustrated. David completely lives contrary to what God wants on numerous occasions. Saul goes crazy. If anything, I think the ultimate tragedy in the Old Testament is Saul. He didn't ask for any of this. He was out running around the countryside looking for livestock. Right? And he gets picked. You're going to be king. Huh? You're a terrible king. What? I didn't ask to be king. Did I ask to be king? But he still ultimately was judged for the choices he made in the midst of it. But he was chosen for a historical role. He was chosen for a historical vocation. And just to be clear, when we look at the first 8 chapters of Romans, it's about individuality. It's about what you choose to do, not over nationalism. But Israel was blessed and commissioned by God solely by his choice, not their worthiness. And that's why Paul says, listen, the word of God didn't fail. You were chosen, you were given all of these things, you were given all of these opportunities, but you kind of began to embrace determinism on your own, which meant we're God's people, so we can do whatever we want. We are elite, we are superior, and we see a lot of it in the church. Right? We look down our noses all the time at people. We look at them and we say, well, you really shouldn't be allowed to do that. I gotta admit, that's just not the right way to live. And we struggle with it. And we go back and forth because we have sort of allowed this concept of blessing equaling worthiness to kind of creep into our own lives. Why has God blessed us with so much? Why has God brought so much? And then we have the different way of looking at it, where we're looking at right now with all of these horrible things going on, when it comes to our weather and things going on, and we step back and go, why is God striking America? Right? Because it's our turn. Because this is where hurricanes hit. Because we're in the path. But we start to look at this idea of determinism, and somehow we've got to step back and say, well, what does it mean? What should we do? What should we do? What should we do? Well, you still make the right choices. You don't let your situation determine your decisions. You don't let your situation determine what you're about to do. And nowhere does Paul say that everybody who was not born with that promise was somehow determined to live poorly. And the ultimate argument, we'll get into next week, is dealing with the idea of, when it says he hardened their heart, is it that heart was hard before they decided to stand in contrast to God, or when they decided to stand in favor of? But Israel had developed the embrace of determinism. We must be special because God chose us over you. And we do have a lot of that. We do struggle with a lot of that, and we go through it. But, getting back to this idea that, we have to remember that we go back to the first 8 chapters of Romans when he's talking about this to get our minds off this idea of determinism. And we step back and we say, okay, it all centers on the Christ event. It all centers on Jesus. And Paul has spent the first 8 chapters of this tremendous letter saying, don't let the Jews look down on you. Don't let the Jews determine what you're going to do. And it's the same thing. I had somebody walk up to me one time and say, I don't go to church because I got hurt. And I said, so you quit loving people too then? So you've never been in another relationship in your whole life because the church hurt you? Well, no. So what? You're letting other people determine? Or you just are getting what you want and using that as the excuse? The reality is that we step behind determinism all the time. My circumstances have determined for me this is what I must do. I'm going to act like a jerk because I feel someone has wronged my child. I'm going to scream at someone because I feel I am validated. I'm going to lose my mind because it's about time. And we see it and we hear it and we see this, I know in our country we talk a lot about entitlement, we talk a lot about, but that's kind of what we've become. I'm going to vote Republican because I'm a Christian. Oh, that one hurt, sorry. That's a stab in the leg. I'm going to vote Democrat because I live in California. There we go. Now I don't know what to even vote in. But the idea is we make these determinations. The situation determines I do this, except nowhere does he say that he then determined that they would live poorly or they would live well. He determined for them a role, a vocation, in order that the Abrahamic covenant could be fulfilled, that they could go be a blessing, and then we see it again on Sinai, but that they could go be a blessing, a royal priesthood, be people who make a difference. And we ultimately still will stand before God absolutely 100% responsible for our own decisions. We're not going to sit there and get to look at him and go, well, you don't understand. You don't get it. I was born into a pretty rough situation. You don't get it. I grew up poor. You don't get it. Right? It's a parable of the talents all over again. I was too afraid of you, so I buried it. But that's not what I asked you to do. And I think for all of us, we have to look around and say, what in my life am I allowing to determine my decisions? Am I getting frustrated at life? Am I getting mad at people and then excusing my behavior because of what they did? And we have all been down that road. Everybody has been down that road. Except that you are allowing someone else to make a decision for you. You have made a decision. I'm going to remain bitter because so-and-so did this terrible, awful thing. And then we sit there and go, but see how bad it was? So now I'm bitter, and I am going to grow old and crusty and angry and be this angry, horrible person for the last 28 years of my life, 48 years of my life. Let's say you're bitter young. And I'm going to hang on to this forever, and then I'm going to blame them until I die. And God's going to look at you and go, hey, what'd you do with that talent? Well, I buried it in the sand because so-and-so was mean to me and did this horrible thing, and I felt the best thing I could do is hang on to my bitterness, let it grow crusty and gray and green, okay, so that the inside of me rotted out slowly over time to the point to where I just didn't care anymore, and I died apathetic. But I showed them. Where are they? They live in Hawaii. Oh, that backfired, right? Because they're not thinking about you. But it's like that's what we do, and we allow determinism. This is my lot in life. I hear that from people all the time. It's just my cross to bear. You can put it down, probably. Right? Somebody mail it to you. But it's a choice that we make, and we've all been down that road. We've all made mistakes. We've all misstepped. We've all started poorly. But we decide where we end. I keep telling, my oldest son, who's tremendous example, I think. And he's on this team, and they just get beat up. I mean, that's all they do. And he gets throttled. And Friday night, he got throttled. But I tell him every time, I said, it's going to do one of two things. It's going to break you, and you're going to be done with this. Or it's going to turn you to iron. Because that's the decision we make. We can let those circumstances determine what's going to happen. Or we can step back and make a decision about what we're going to allow it to do. And I keep telling him and all of his buddies, let it turn you to iron. Get stronger. Get tougher, get meaner, get nasty. On football. In life we want compassion and love and concern and tears. But on a football field, no tears. But unless you want to. But that's the idea of it, is that we make a decision. As Christians, we can let the things that happen in our lives determine that we become a chaotic mess, or we can let the things in our lives determine that we are going to get stronger. And what am I going to do with it? It's a decision that we make. And so next week we'll get into the second half of this, because he talks about Pharaoh and bringing in a non-Hebrew into this historical discussion he's having. It makes it really quite interesting, because now we're getting into the real point of determinism. Right? So let's close in prayer, and we're going to pray for Florida and receive our offering, as Steve has so subtly sent me the message. All right. So, Father, first of all, we lift up Florida and Houston and all the people in Mexico affected by the earthquake, and all the people who have been through so much, God. I just pray right now that the churches in those areas be your leaders in taking care of what's going on. I pray that the churches be a blessing to all the people. And God, I just pray right now for those in Storm's path who chose to ride it out. God, I pray that you just keep them safe. I pray for, with the impending recovery and all the things that take place, God. God, I pray your blessing over the offering this morning. I pray your blessing over how it is spent in God moving forward in wisdom. And I pray for all those things this morning in your name. Amen.